In my experience, every family responds very differently and uniquely. It's very hard to predict, and we don't predict anymore. In our experience, we found that you can't judge families by the way they look or their ethnicity or their age. We often get quite surprised with families when we think, we're going to ask if their loved one can be an organ donor, and you go into the room expecting them to say no and they say yes, and vice versa. So no, you can't judge.
The concept of brain death is something that's very difficult for a lot of people to understand, and I'm not just talking about families, but even for medical and nursing staff, particularly if they don't have a lot of experience with it. But brain death is actual physical death of the brain. There's absolutely no circulation to the brain, and there are very specific tests that the patient will undergo to determine that their brain has died, and the test is performed by 2 different doctors, and it's under very rigorous testing circumstances and done very professionally. The family can be present during testing so that they can see for themselves the responses or lack thereof that indicate whether the patient is brain dead or not. So the other thing is too that for families that have had, and most of our families have had no experience of brain death before, finding themselves with their precious loved one in our intensive care unit, it's very difficult to grasp the concept of brain death when in some situations we've had the patient in our unit for maybe several days. They may have initially been sedated after their initial injury or the medical event that rendered them, in our intensive care unit. And so they still look like they're sleeping. They've still got all the tubes and wires and things connected. They've still got a ventilator attached, and their chest is rising and falling, giving the impression that they might be breathing, even though the machine is actually doing the mechanical work of breathing for them. The patient will feel warm. They look pink because the ventilator is pushing air and oxygen into the lungs. The circulation is taking that up and feeding that oxygen to the heart. You remove the ventilator and the patient will not breathe. In the case of brain death, there will be absolutely no effort to breathe because it is not possible, because the brain has died. So, I realise that it is a very difficult thing to get your head around, and it's very hard to comprehend how can my loved one be dead when they still feel warm. They don't look dead, and I can still see, heartbeat squiggles coming across the screen. How can they be dead?
I think it's really important that everyone talks about death because it's part of everyday life. And in the context of organ donation, if you've had that conversation at home within your family, when it becomes time to make that decision, it's much easier if you know what your loved one's views were on organ donation.
I know that Chris and I very much view our role as supporting the families and also our medical and nursing staff through this whole process. If I just focus on the family, it's providing them with factual information and answering questions and sort of putting to rest any issues they might have around organ donation. There's a lot of urban myths out there around organ donation, and a lot of those things need clarifying before people can make a decision. By no means is it anyone's job in our hospital, and I believe in this country, to go in and try and twist someone's arm and say you must donate your loved one's organ. There's no choice. It's not necessarily the right thing for every family, and people will have their own individual reasons, and we won't question people about their decision to say no. We accept and support and treat everyone the same regardless of their decision. And whilst we know the huge impact that it has when someone is able to say yes to donation, we are also dealing with a family at a time of huge loss and immense grief. And as I say, it's not for us to make that decision on their behalf. The families have to live with that decision afterwards, and really we want to support them through their decision-making process so that they can live with that decision afterwards. I do know from things like attending the Thanksgiving services and various study days that Chris and I have attended or spoken on, there have often been donor families that have spoken and also recipients that have spoken, and I've been really impacted by both sides. When I hear the donor families speak, there's that overwhelming sense of grief that comes through, but there's also a huge, overwhelming sense of gratitude for being able to have an opportunity to make something positive come out of such a negative experience as losing their precious loved one. And of course, we hear from recipients who are just so incredibly grateful to have literally a new lease on life, to have, what was a death sentence hanging over them, has now given them life. And it's amazing to see that, and I know that Chris and I feel very privileged to be part of, or a very small part of that process where that can happen.